Alessandro Striggio was a Mantuan nobleman who spent his working life between the courts of Mantua and primarily Medici Florence. And in 1561, it's known that he wrote a piece in 40 parts. It's not for a choir of about 40 people singing the usual 4 or 6 lines, but 40 separate parts. This is not music in the split choir style we all know from Venice, the music of the two Gabrielis. Striggio's style is more ornate, and in any case comes before most of the Gabrieli's work, which is from the following decades right up into the 17th century. This is music from 1566. This really predates that. By 1566, he had written a mass for 40 voices based on material from the 40-voice motet that he'd already written, and he then took it as a gift to the Holy Roman Emperor in Vienna. Striggio's patron, Cosimo de' Medici, had been trying to persuade the emperor to name him King of Tuscany, and an indication of how important this diplomatic mission was that he undertook it right in the middle of winter, crossing the Alps on 2 horses with the part books for the Mass on a donkey. He then continued his journey with the Mass to the Munich court, where Lassus was the musical director. You can imagine there the number of instruments that would have been involved, which was very much the taste of the court there. And then on to Paris, where a performance was put on in the Château de Saint-Maur with Catherine de' Medici, the mother of the French king, in attendance. He was then due to go home, but wrote to Cosimo de' Medici, his patron, to say that actually he decided to take a little detour to London to meet the virtuosos of the music profession there, which he did. And it's later known he met Queen Elizabeth. Did he meet Byrd and Tallis? This is the big question. How can he not have met Tallis, the preeminent composer of the day? There's intriguingly little information about this, but from 40 years later, there's some evidence from 1610, at the moment that Tallis's Spem and alium is rejigged as an English underlaid piece, Sing and Glorify, that 40 years ago, that's in the 1560s, there came a man from Italy with a mass in 30 parts, we assume that's just understatement, and it being sung made a heavenly harmony. So that means it was performed in London, it being sung. And the story is that the Duke of Norfolk, hearing this, said, "Is there not an Englishman that can make a song like this?" And Tallis supposedly wrote Spem and alium in response to that, which means that he wrote it because of this mass. The common argument with the Spem by Tallis and the 40-part motet that's been published for many years by Striggio is, of course, the Striggio is not as good as the Tallis. Well, 2 things. Firstly, it predates it by several years. The Striggio predates the Spem. But the other thing, it's like comparing coffee and wine. They're different drinks. Striggio works in a very different way. He writes large harmonic sequences, slow-moving ones, which become kind of mesmeric after a while. And round these big blocks writes a lot of filigree detail.
Well, it's just a question of finding all the different balances and working out the relationship between the instruments and the voices, particularly making sure that we get enough text in the voices and enough texture compared to the instrumental timbre in each of the choirs, and also the relationship between the surround sound that we're setting up and the stereo picture that we're setting up has to be a sort of consistent picture. There's also a balance to be struck between the detail that you get in each of the choirs and the sort of the overall glow.
this mass was lost until just a few years ago, where David Moroni, an esteemed keyboard player, a musicologist, who had been looking for this mass for a while, discovered it at the Bibliothèque Nationale de Paris. I've now made my own edition with Brian Clark of the Early Music Company from the same source materials, the microfilm of the part books from Paris, and this is the first commercial recording of it. A lot of questions about how you put together a piece like this. Do you do it with just 40 voices, or do you bring instrumental colour in? And I've gone down the Munich route. Perhaps that's the one court where we know they did involve a lot of instruments, and given it a lot of colour with viols, lutes, sackbuts, cornets, and dulcians, this early bassoon, and it's a very colourful experience.
I think it's a fantastic idea, because otherwise it would all be the same colour. It's a great idea to have totally different colours for each choir. There's different instruments. So there's the choir that's got the shawms in, for instance, which is an unmistakable sound colour. And then we've got, in our choir, we're mostly accompanied by the lutes. So that's, there's all different noises. A sackbut choir and it's fantastic.
This is what early music's all about, trying to recreate for modern ears what sounds might have been heard in the 16th century. And it's a blend of research and imagination. You're having to use your imagination based on archival sources, and it's just a voyage of discovery, really, which is great.
So now, as if this weren't enough, all these, about 58 people, some of them doubling for this 40-part texture, you now have to add another 11 because we're doing this phenomenal Agnus Dei, 60 parts. Quite normal in Renaissance music, Renaissance publications, to expand the texture for the last movement, whether it's a motet or a madrigal or a mass. But instead of 4 voices going to 6, we've now got 40 to 60. So we've got to move the lectern. The Mass works extremely well with the 5 separate choirs in the round, with listeners in the middle. The fascinating thing is, although it sounds incredibly grand, it's not like the Berlioz Grande Messe des Morts, where you have these enormous choirs sort of fighting off each other. It's a more intricate thing. And this is the same in the way as the Gabrieli's work in Venice, where it's a kind of sacred conversation. It's not just huge left to right power play. In fact, it's 5 choir geometric sound design, but it's music at times of real subtlety, which is something that works incredibly well on microphone and in recordings. Really, to get the benefit of this, the surround sound recording techniques, for those who can listen to them on their DVD player, is the perfect way to hear this piece.
One of the challenges that we've got to deal with is the business of size, sheer size, and the intimacy that we're trying to capture, as well as the bigger picture. There are lots of players accompanying the singers, and at various times we want to either bring them out or sublimate them in favour of a particular image. I mean, you can actually get it so that you obscure everything by going for too much detail. We could plaster the place in microphones and get everyone on a separate feed, it wouldn't actually help, because you just obscure the bigger picture.
It's really nice to be part of this, because Decca used to have a lot of choral music on its books, but we've sort of strayed away from that lately. And this year we're back to doing some choral music, and it's great to have something like this project that's such a huge piece, and to hear this choir and all of these forces together is fantastic.
We have most of the UK's Renaissance specialist groups represented. We have players from the Rose Consort of Viols and Fretwork playing together for the very first time, which is rather lovely. Erin Headley, the world's top player of the lirone, the multi-stringed instrument that Striggio himself was a virtuoso on. Players from the English Cornet and Sackbut Ensemble, not one but 4 Renaissance lutanists, double reeds and more brass from the City Music, Bill Lyons Ensemble. The whole thing has turned into a huge party, and I've been like a sort of child in a sweet shop on adrenaline for several days, just having the most brilliant time.
Lovely. You can just smell the money, can't you? You can smell the 16th century money. You think, if I send him this, I've only got to pay for Striggio 2 horses and a donkey to carry the part books. Donkey dies later on. And that's cheaper than a bribe.
This is not radio, folks. Come on, wakey wakey. Here we go. Right, brilliant. This fantastic story.